Musicians and producers are constantly looking for the next big gear upgrade, trying to get their sound to be professional. Well, I'm here to tell you that most of those gear upgrades aren't really going to add that much quality on top of what you already have, with the exception of one thing. In this video, we're going to be talking about acoustic treatment and why it might be the missing secret sauce that's keeping you from your potential. Stay tuned. Hello, everybody. Dylan, COVID-19 Hair Pines here. Today, we're going to be talking about acoustic panels and why they really might be the big gear upgrade that you're missing to get a professional sounding recording or a professional sounding mix. And oftentimes, this isn't the most popular of opinions. It's a little controversial, because everyone loves the feeling of getting that new guitar amp or that new mic preamp or that new plugin, thinking that that is the thing that is going to get them up and above the threshold into professional territory. But here's the honest truth. If you don't have acoustic treatment in your recording room, your recordings are probably going to suck. And if you don't have acoustic treatment in your mixing room, your mixes are probably going to suck. It's going to degrade the quality because it is keeping your recordings and your mixes from being accurate. So for the uninitiated, let's talk about what acoustic treatment does. So to put it simply, it sucks up the bad and inaccurate sound and leaves it sounding level and accurate. To be more complicated, it's absorbing sound waves that are bouncing around the room and coloring your sound. By absorbing these rogue frequencies, it keeps them from building up in energy and playing tricks on your ears and playing tricks on your microphones. So you can think about it this way. It's keeping all of the color of a room out of whatever is listening in that session. So if you're in a recording session, what's listening is the microphone. That's basically the ears of that session. So it's absorbing all that bad sound in the room so that the only thing that the microphone is catching is the neutral room sound and the instrument. That's it. And what's listening in the mixing session, obviously, is your ears. You want to make sure that the room is not coloring the sound of your speakers before it gets to your ears. So let's talk about why we're wanting to get rid of this stuff. For mixing, it's because we want accuracy from our monitors. As these frequencies, as these sound waves are bouncing around the room, they are changing levels in different parts of the frequency area. And so what ends up happening is that when sound waves leave your speakers, they bounce around the room. Once they finally reach your ears, they're not actually what came out of the speakers. Maybe the upper mids are a lot heavier, or the low mids are a lot lighter, or the bass is super heavy. So ultimately, what is coming out of the DAW and then coming out of the speakers is not what is reaching your ears. There is a loss in translation. Honestly, if you've ever experienced just the extreme frustration of spending hours and hours on a mix only to take it out to your car or play it on your phone and it just absolutely falls apart, your lack of acoustic treatment is probably why. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. Let's say that your room adds a lot of low end, which is an extremely common thing for rooms to do. So any sound that comes out of your speaker is going to go out into your room, it's going to bounce around, it's going to turn up the volume of the low end, and then it's going to reach your ears. So what that means is that you are going to perceive the mix as having a lot more low end than it actually does. So ultimately, that means you're not going to turn your low end up in your mix very much at all because you think it already has enough. And so you end up having an extremely weak mix. You've got a mix where it sounds great in this room, but when you take it anywhere else, the entire bottom falls out, there's no foundation, and there's no energy, and it just ends up sounding like an amateur mix. So now let's talk about recording. Why do we need acoustic treatment with recordings? Well, we are trying to get a dry sound. We want to be able to add any ambience that we need to do in the mix so that we can place and position that particular instrument where it needs to be. We want to be able to keep it nice and up close in the mix or push it far away in the mix. It doesn't matter. But if room sound gets baked into the sound of that particular instrument, it becomes so much more difficult to actually get a good sounding mix with that instrument, especially once you start adding compression. Compression really brings out room sound. even if something sounds really dry at first, like maybe you've recorded it, you're listening back, you're like, oh yeah, I don't hear any reverb, I don't hear any room sound, it sounds good, I don't need to do anything. You're gonna get halfway through the mix of that song, and all of a sudden you're just gonna be like, why does it sound like everything is in here? It sounds like there's just echoes happening. What's going on? It's because that room reverb was there all along. You just didn't really know it. So with instrumentation, we use acoustic treatment so that we can have more versatility in the mix, so that we're not baking in a sound that ultimately may end up hurting us more than helping us. So now that we've talked about why you need acoustic panels, well, the next obvious question is, what acoustic panels do you actually need? There's 3 main types of acoustic treatment that you should be considering for your home studio, and that is acoustic panels, bass traps, and clouds. Now, if you're a little bit more advanced, maybe you're a little bit farther along, you got a bit more of a budget, there is actually a 4th, which is diffusion panels. But we're not really going to talk about that in this video, because once you start getting into diffusion, you start getting into a little bit more of a complex look at how acoustical physics actually works. But let's talk about these 3 different kinds of acoustic treatment. First off, we're going to talk about acoustic panels. And I'm very, very intentionally saying acoustic panels, not acoustic foam. If you can avoid acoustic foam, I really would recommend it. I know I've had it too in the past. It's so much cheaper, but ultimately it could end up hurting you more than helping you. And here's what I mean. Acoustic panels, like the one behind me, well, they soak up a lot more of the frequency spectrum. They soak up the bad stuff from the top end all the way down to around the lower mids. Whereas acoustic foam, well, it still starts absorbing these frequencies at the very top of the spectrum, but it only goes down to about the mids. And that's a big problem. If you have it in your recording room, well, that means that you're going to have some really muddy sounding recordings, because all that top end is going to get absorbed. It's going to be a lot more level, but all of the low mids gunk is absolutely just going to stay there. So you're going to end up having dull, muddy, bottom heavy recordings. And if you're ever confused why, that's probably why. Or if you're using acoustic foam with mixes, you're going to have the opposite problem. Your mixes are going to be too bright and too thin. The reason for that being that it's leaving all of this low mids energy, which is still bouncing around the room and is coloring what you're hearing in your ears. So you perceive the low mids as being much louder than it actually is, which means that you are mixing it up way, way less. It's exactly what we talked about earlier. If there is lots of energy in the room in a particular spectrum, you're probably going to have too little of that energy in your mix. So how many acoustic panels do you need to buy? Well, for mixing, usually the rule of thumb is 2 right behind your speakers, 2 at the very end of your room, and 2 directly to your left and your right at your first reflection points. If you aren't sure where to place your panels, well, we've actually got a great video on DIY acoustic panel setup. So it's actually down in the description below, so just go check it out there. Now, if you're recording, it's best to surround the room or the part of the room where you're recording in these acoustic panels. Basically, if a microphone can possibly be pointing at a wall and that wall is close to the instrument, you want to make sure that there's an acoustic panel there. As far as what acoustic panels to buy, well, GIK Acoustics is always a safe bet. They make really high quality products. But also, you can go the DIY route. You can build your own acoustic panels, just like I did. Now, there are YouTube videos just all over the internet on how to design and craft your own acoustic panels. It's definitely a lot cheaper, but it is a lot more work. So it just kind of depends if budget or effort is more important to you. Either way, you're going to end up with a great product. So next up, let's talk about bass traps. So bass traps are the things that you see in corners of studios. You can see my bass traps behind me in the corners of my studio. They do exactly what their name implies. They trap the bass frequencies. So bass frequencies are notoriously difficult to be absorbed by acoustic panels, which is why bass traps are a thing. They are basically just filled to the brink with absorptive material so that these really, really slow waveforms that are all of these low-end frequencies actually do get absorbed. Now, the reason they go into the corners is because that is usually where the biggest bass buildup is. Why that is, Acoustical physics. Here's the thing about bass traps. They are expensive, but they're necessary. In my opinion, bass buildup in your room is the number one reason why you're probably struggling to get your low end balanced. It's one of the biggest reasons why whenever you go to your car or you go to a friend's house and you play your mix, it just absolutely falls apart. It's because of that bass buildup. And for recording, not having any bass traps in the corner of the room, where you're actually recording your instruments, it might be one of the biggest reasons why your instruments tend to sound so boomy and so muddy. Because all of that low end stuff is not getting absorbed. All the high end stuff might be getting absorbed just because, you've done your due diligence, you've put up acoustic panels around the room, but that low end is staying there. So what I would say to do is to buy as many bass traps as you can afford right now. If that's only, 4 bass traps, maybe just one for like the top of each corner, that's okay. You can start with that. And then just as you are able to build up your budget, as you're able to save up a little bit more money, just fill in the rest of that corner as you can. So finally, let's talk about clouds. So clouds are still important. There's still something that I would invest in, but out of the 3 different types of acoustic panels, it's probably the least important of the 3. So what clouds are, is they're just basically acoustic panels that are put on your ceiling in between your ears and your monitors. That's, of course, if you're mixing. If you are recording, then it just goes above whatever instrument you're actually trying to track. Now, these are just catching the reflections that are popping up onto the ceiling and down into your ears or your microphone. Now, if you have a home studio, odds are you're not going to be able to afford really, really large studio quality clouds. That's partially just because studio quality clouds are extremely thick and they have a little bit of an air gap between the ceiling and the cloud itself. And a lot of people just don't have that kind of real estate. In a studio, you might have larger ceilings, but in a home, a lot of times your ceilings are somewhere between 8 and 11 feet. And so you just might not be able to buy a thick enough panel to actually have it go above your head. So if that's the case, I would still probably go with a solid panel if you can, somewhere between 2 and 4 inches. And then try to get, again, if you can, just a little bit of air gap. Honestly, with your acoustic panels as well, if you can get a little bit of air gap in between the wall and the acoustic panels, it just makes it work even more efficiently. Basically, sound waves will bounce through, they'll go through the absorptive material, then they'll bounce against the wall, bounce right back, and go through it a second time. So it just makes it a little bit more effective. So honestly, what I would do, get some clouds, get a carpet underneath you if you can, because that's going to handle just some of the reflections that are hitting the floor. Doesn't have to be super thick carpet, just a small carpet can help. And honestly, if you're able to invest in those 3 things, if you're able to get your panels, if you're able to get your bass traps, if you are able to get your clouds, your room is going to sound so much better. And your recordings and your mixes, maybe for the first time, are going to sound incredible. And they're going to sound accurate. They're going to sound like they actually sound like in the room. When you ever take them anywhere else, it's going to sound just as good everywhere as it does right here. So that said, acoustic treatment is, of course, one of many different things that you need to do to get the best sound that you can. So what are some other things that you can do? Well, you can look at your room that you are using for recording or for mixing. The room itself has a huge, huge effect on the sound. Obviously, that's what we've been talking about this entire time, but every room sounds different. You're going to have a much different room tone if you are mixing or recording in a small 6 foot by 6 foot box room than if you are mixing or recording in your living room, which is much, much larger than that. You're going to have different problems. You're going to have to buy different treatment potentially. So ultimately, if you have the ability to, try to pick the best room you can. We actually have a video on room choice down in the description below that you can watch to help you just figure out exactly what you need to be looking for. And finally, if you're mixing, I would really recommend you work on your monitor placement. That is so much more important than you think it is. Getting your monitors to be in the exact right spot in your room where they sound best and where they are balanced between your ears is going to have a huge effect on how accurate your speakers actually are, which means it's going to have a huge effect on how much your mix is able to translate to other speakers and other rooms. So again, we've got another video on this down in the description below. It's really, really helpful just figuring out exactly, why is it that where I put my monitors actually affects the sound and how can I optimize it. So hopefully this has been convincing to you that the most important gear you could possibly get is acoustic treatment. But of course, getting acoustic treatment isn't suddenly going to make you a better mixer. That's actually why Rob Mazes, the founder of Musician on a Mission, you've probably seen him a million times on this channel, he has created a free workshop on the 7 key steps to getting a radio-ready mix. He's created a whole new approach to recording and mixing at home that has worked for thousands of people. 36,000 people at this point have taken this course, and it has been fantastic. So now it's your turn. If you want to learn the 7 key steps to making radio-ready music at home, and you want to save so much precious time on figuring it all out yourself, then just go and click the link on screen or down in the description below. It's absolutely free. We're going to send you a personal link right to your email, and you'll be on your way. And of course, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. We make tips and tricks on recording and mixing and songwriting and business just like this every single week on this channel. We'd seriously love to help you grow. So that's going to be it for me. This has been Dylan Pines with Musician on a Mission. And remember, create regardless.